quiet thank you to its_Fergo for suggesting this story. There's something that feels right about someone wanting to spend time with Medusa. Not the surface version, the monster version, but the real thing underneath. The story that was always there, waiting for someone to tell it slowly enough for it to breathe. So let this be that telling. Get comfortable. Let the night settle around you. We're going to take our time with this one. There is something worth remembering about myths before we begin tonight. They were never still. They were never written once, sealed shut, and passed unchanged through time. Myths moved the way rivers move. They shifted with every voice that carried them. They were spoken beside fires, whispered across harbours, recited in crowded halls, and repeated beneath open skies. And each time they were told, something changed. A warning became a lesson. A hero became crueler or kinder. A villain became more convenient, and those called monsters changed most of all. The ancient Greeks understood this better than anyone. They did not rely on one sacred book or one final version of their stories. They had Homer, Hesiod, Pindar, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and countless others, each shaping the myths in different ways for different times. A story told in one century could mean something entirely new in the next. What mattered to one city might be questioned by another. Myths were living things, and living things never remain exactly the same. Much of what was once told has also been lost. Scrolls vanished in fires. Libraries fell silent. Time wore away voices that were once loud and certain. What survived was only part of a much larger world of storytelling, and even what survived did so because someone chose to preserve it, copy it, and pass it forward. That matters when we speak of Medusa. Because the version most people know is only one version. The face of snakes. The gaze that turned men to stone. The monster waiting in darkness for a hero to arrive. It is a powerful image, but it is not the only image. Beneath it lies an older and sadder shape of the story. Not one where Medusa is perfectly innocent, or where the gods are simply cruel, because myths are rarely that simple, but one where the lines are softer, more human, and far more tragic. So tonight, let the familiar version drift for a while. Let the sharp edges blur like reflections on water. Let us move slowly through the halls of this old story, not rushing toward the famous ending, but pausing where others rarely pause, looking into the corners, listening for what was missed. The night is already quiet enough for it. And so we begin, not with Perseus, and not with a hero's triumph, but much earlier than that, at the far edge of the world, where the maps of the ancient mind faded into shadow, and where three sisters were said to dwell. In the oldest layers of Greek mythology, there were beings known as the Gorgons. Their name carried meanings tied to dread, awe, and terror. They were not ordinary creatures, but figures of the threshold, guardians of the place where the known world ended and something stranger began. There were three sisters, Stheno, Euryale, and Medusa. In Hesiod's Theogony, one of the earliest surviving works to organise the Greek gods and their origins, the Gorgons are described as daughters of Forces and Ceto, ancient sea powers older than many of the Olympians themselves. Their parents belonged to a more primal generation of divinity, linked to the deep ocean, to darkness, and to the unknowable places beneath the waves. So the Gorgons were born from old waters. They were said to live beyond Oceanus, near the western limits of the world, close to the garden of the Hesperides where golden apples grew and evening light came to rest. To the Greeks, this was not simply a location. It was a symbol of distance, a place beyond comfort, beyond certainty, beyond familiar lore. Two of the sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were immortal. Time could not claim them. Age could not touch them. They belonged to the long endurance of divine things. But Medusa was different. Among the three sisters, Medusa alone was mortal. She could be wounded, she could suffer, she could die. And in a family where no one else carried that burden, Medusa lived with the quiet knowledge that she alone would not last forever. Hold that for a moment, because it tends to get lost in the louder details of her story. In a family of immortals, children of beings older than the Olympians themselves, sisters who could not die. Medusa was the one whose life could be taken. She was the vulnerable one, the one who could bleed and suffer and end. And she lived apparently in full awareness of this fact, surrounded by sisters who would endure long after she was gone. There is something quietly devastating in that before any other element of her story has even begun. Medusa was born into a kind of existential aloneness that had nothing to do with geography or curse. She was the mortal among immortals, the one who could be hurt. Perhaps the ancient tradition sensed this too. Perhaps that is, in some deep structural way, why it was Medusa, and not one of her sisters who accumulated the story she did. The one who could die was the one whose dying mattered. The one who could be hurt was the one whose hurt became myth. Now we come to the part of the story that exists mostly in Ovid, and here it is worth pausing to place Ovid in his proper context, because understanding him changes how we hear what he wrote. Publius Ovidius Naso, Ovid, was a Roman poet writing in Latin at the very turn of the first millennium of the Common Era. His great work, the Metamorphoses, is an extraordinary and seemingly inexhaustible collection of transformation stories drawn from Greek and Roman mythology, written in flowing dactylic hexameter and spanning 15 books. It is one of the most influential works in the entire Western literary tradition. Countless poets, painters, playwrights, and storytellers have drawn from it for 2,000 years and continue to draw from it still. But Ovid was not a Greek poet. He was not writing in the era of Hesiod or Homer. He was separated from those earlier sources by something like 6 or 7 centuries, which is an enormous span of time during which the myths had been travelling through many hands, many cultures, many political climates. He was writing under the reign of the Emperor Augustus, a period of extraordinary cultural production, but also extraordinary political pressure, a time when stories about power and transformation carried implications that a careful reader would not miss. Ovid himself was eventually exiled by Augustus, for reasons that remain somewhat mysterious but seem to have involved both an indiscreet poem and some unnamed personal offence. He spent the rest of his life on the Black Sea, far from Rome, separated from everything he loved. He never returned. He died in exile. It is perhaps worth keeping that in mind when we read his version of Medusa, a story about a beautiful woman transformed and then isolated at the edge of the world, never to return to what she was. The poet who wrote it knew something about exile, something about being changed by powers beyond your control into something you never chose to be. In Ovid's telling of Medusa's story, which he gives to us through the narrative of Perseus, almost as an aside, a story within a story, as Perseus recounts his quest to an audience at a feast, there is a passage that is easy to speed past and devastating if you slow down for it. Before everything else, Ovid tells us, Medusa was beautiful. Not beautiful in a generic, decorative way. Specifically, particularly, remarkably beautiful. And the feature that Ovid singles out, the feature that drew the most attention, the feature that will later become the centre of her curse, was her hair. Rich and extraordinary hair, the kind that made her remarkable even among beautiful things. The ancient world understood that beauty was not a neutral quality. It attracted attention, and attention from the wrong sources was a species of danger. The mythological tradition is full of women and men whose beauty brought disaster upon them. Troilus, Ganymede, Hyacinthus, Narcissus, Helen, whose face launched 1,000 ships. And there was a cultural understanding embedded in these stories that to be beautiful in a world of gods was to be visible in a way that made you vulnerable. The gods looked at beautiful things, and when a god wanted something, wanting and taking were often the same gesture. Medusa, beautiful and mortal at the edge of the world, drew the attention of Poseidon. Poseidon was the god of the sea, of earthquakes, of horses, a god of enormous destabilizing power, one of the eldest of the Olympians, brother to Zeus and Hades. In the oldest Greek religion, he was perhaps more central than later traditions remembered him, a god of tremendous force whose domain was not merely the ocean, but the deep, trembling power beneath the earth itself, he saw Medusa. And then, in Ovid's telling, he pursued her into the temple of Athena, the goddess of wisdom and defensive warfare and craft. And there, in that sacred space, something happened that the ancient text handles with the careful obliqueness of a tradition that did not always name violence directly but understood its shape. She was violated there, in the temple, in the place that should have been safest. And then Athena, the goddess whose temple had been desecrated, turned her gaze upon Medusa. What Athena's transformation of Medusa meant to ancient audiences is a question that classicists and mythologists have debated for a very long time, and the honest answer is that we cannot be entirely certain. The ancient world did not leave us commentary that settles the question cleanly. What we have is the story itself in various versions and the surrounding context of how Greek mythology understood curses, transformations and divine action. Some readers, then and now, have understood the transformation as punishment, Athena punishing Medusa for the desecration of her temple, for the violation of a sacred space, as though Medusa were somehow responsible for what happened to her there. This reading has been enormously influential, particularly in later moralizing traditions that wanted mythology to function as straightforward ethical instruction. Bad things happen to people who do bad things, or who are in bad places. The temple was sacred. What happened there was an offence. Medusa suffered for it. But there are other ways to read it that feel more consistent with the actual texture of Greek mythology, and with Athena's character as the tradition develops it across many sources. Athena could not punish Poseidon. This is the structural reality that the myth never quite says aloud, but which is always present as context. Gods in Greek mythology rarely punish gods, and when they do, it is only through specific narrative mechanisms, formal disputes resolved by Zeus, specific transgressions with established consequences. Poseidon was the Olympian, Zeus's brother, a god of equivalent standing to Athena herself. The desecration of her temple was an offence to her, but Poseidon would not suffer for it. The divine power structure simply did not work that way. So Athena did what she could, in the direction she could reach. She transformed Medusa. And when you understand the specific nature of the transformation, when you look at what Medusa became and what that becoming accomplished, it is possible to read it not as punishment, but as the particular, terrible protection that was available to a goddess who could not protect a mortal woman through ordinary means. She made Medusa into something that could never again be approached, something that destroyed simply by being seen, something that even Poseidon presumably would not reach for again, a transformation of invulnerability at the cost of everything else. Was this kindness? Was it cruelty? Was it something that the ancient Greek moral imagination didn't have a clean word for? A survival mechanism that looked like a monster from the outside? The myth doesn't resolve this, and perhaps that is appropriate. The myth is not a parable with a lesson at the end. It is a story that holds something complicated and asks you to sit with it. What the ancient Greeks did understand, which is reflected across the entire mythological tradition, is that transformation in their cosmos was almost always about change caused by outside forces. Daphne, running from Apollo, became a laurel tree. Actaeon, accidentally seeing Artemis bathe, became a stag and was torn apart by his own hounds. Arachne, weaving a tapestry that mocked the gods, became a spider. Io, loved by Zeus, became a white cow. In story after story, the transformation is something that happens to a person. Not a punishment exactly in the moral sense, but a change in fundamental nature caused by intersection with divine power. Medusa's transformation fits this pattern. She was changed, and the change was permanent and devastating, and had nothing to do with who she chose to be. Now let yourself imagine the period that the myths skip over almost entirely, the years between the transformation and the arrival of the hero, the long, quiet, largely undocumented span of time during which Medusa lived at the edge of the world with her sisters, changed into what she had become, and simply continued existing. Myths are not interested in this period. They skip toward the famous moments, the quest, the confrontation, the victory. because myths are interested in action, in the events that define a story rather than the ordinary or the in-between. The years that Medusa spent simply living after her transformation are, by the standards of mythology, uneventful. Nothing happened that the tradition thought worth recording, but those years existed. Imagine the quality of that existence. The particular landscape of the mythological edge of the world, grey and liminal, not quite a real place and not quite an imaginary one. A geography that functioned more as emotional truth than cartographic fact. Ancient sources placed the Gorgons in various directions from the centre of the known world, sometimes in the far west, sometimes near Libya, sometimes simply in a place so remote as to be effectively beyond geography. What all these placings have in common is the sense of distance, of removal, of a space that was not meant for ordinary human access. The light there would have been different. The way the ancient imagination constructed these borderland places, they existed in a kind of permanent twilight, adjacent to the realm of the dead in ways that ordinary landscapes were not. The sound of the ocean, probably. The Gorgons were the daughters of sea deities, and the ocean seems to have belonged to their world in some fundamental way. The constant, patient sound of waves against rock, the smell of salt air, the feeling of wind that came from no particular direction and went nowhere you could track. And Medusa in the middle of it all. We do not know whether Stheno and Euryale stayed with her. We might hope they did, that some portion of what had existed between the sisters before survived the transformation, that the ordinary love between siblings proved durable enough to outlast the change. But we don't know. The myth doesn't tell us, which is itself a kind of loneliness. The immortal sisters continued into the tradition, as minor figures, occasionally mentioned, never quite centred. Whether they remained near Medusa through her changed years or whether they kept their distance, whether the transformation had made even closeness between them impossible, the texts don't say. What would it have been like? To become something that destroys by being seen? To know that any mortal who met your gaze directly would be turned to stone, would become a statue of the fear they felt in the moment of meeting you? She couldn't look at people, or rather, she could look at them, but they could not safely look at her, which amounts to a kind of wall between her and every other living being. She would have learned, presumably, to watch the ground, to perceive the world obliquely, through peripheral vision, to be careful always about the direction of her eyes. Not out of malice. She had no malice. The curse operated entirely independent of her intentions, but out of the same careful instinct that keeps anyone with an uncontrollable power from wielding it unnecessarily. There must have been a period of learning this, a period, early in the transformation, when she'd not yet calibrated how to exist in the world as what she'd become, when the adjustment was still raw and terrible and full of accidental consequences. We don't know the length of this period or what it cost her. The myths give us none of it, but human nature, and Medusa was human, mortal and human, before she was anything else, suggests that there would have been a long and difficult time of simply learning to live inside her new reality. And the hair. The extraordinary hair that Ovid tells us she was famous for, that drew attention and admiration. Now a living mass of serpents, each one a creature in its own right, moving with their own slow rhythms warm against her shoulders and neck. Would she have learned to feel them as part of herself, as company, in the absence of other company? The myth suggests that the serpents were frightening, that they were part of what made her monstrous in the eyes of others. But from the inside, from her perspective, they were simply what her hair had become. She would have learned to live with the weight of them. The occasional cool pressure of scales, the way they moved in response to her emotions perhaps, or to the temperature of the air. They were alive, and they were part of her. And whatever their meaning to the outside world, their meaning to her was simply the meaning of the self, familiar, present, neither good nor bad in the way that the body's own workings are neither good nor bad. There is a version of this that is simply grief, the slow, ongoing, unspectacular grief of someone who has lost something that cannot be recovered, who must build a life anyway in the aftermath, who wakes up every day in the same changed body and has to choose again whether to keep going. Not a dramatic grief, Not the kind that makes for interesting mythology, but the kind that most losses actually produce. Quiet, persistent, woven into the texture of every ordinary day. Greek mythology doesn't often give us access to this interior experience. It gives us events, encounters, divine interventions, consequences. The texture of ordinary suffering, the long years between the dramatic moments, tends to disappear. But it was there. For Medusa, those years were there. She moved through them, however she moved through them, and became whatever she became in their passage. She did not stop being Medusa in the years the tradition neglected to record. She simply continued in the grey borderland, in the sound of the ocean, with whatever was left of what she had been before. There is another element of Medusa's existence that deserves attention, because it speaks to something the ancient imagination understood about people who are made into monsters by their circumstances, and that is the question of the statues. Around the cave where Medusa lived, in the tradition established by accounts that fed into Ovid and then continued into later classical sources, there were said to be stone figures, statues of men and animals who had looked at her directly and been turned to stone in the instant of meeting her gaze. They stood where they had stood in that moment, frozen into rock, a permanent record of every encounter that had gone wrong. Think about what that meant for her daily existence. She was surrounded by the frozen shapes of beings who had come to her place and looked at her and been destroyed by the looking. Some of these presumably had come with hostile intent. Heroes on quests, warriors looking to prove themselves against the monster at the edge of the world. But some may have come from curiosity. Some may have wandered there without fully understanding the danger. And all of them, whatever their intention, had ended the same way. She could not have failed to see these statues. They were all around her. Every one of them was a reminder of what she had become, not in the abstract, not as a fact she could forget, but as a literal, physical, unchanging presence in her daily landscape. She was surrounded by the evidence of what happened when the world encountered her, and she couldn't undo any of it. This is the particular horror that the mythological tradition embedded in Medusa's existence, and it is worth sitting with it for a moment rather than rushing past. Her curse was not simply personal. It was not only about what she had lost or what she had become. It extended outward into every encounter she had with the world, and the world kept arriving, curious, aggressive, well-intentioned, ill-intentioned, and she kept being unable to control what her presence did to it. There is something here about the experience of being perceived as dangerous, regardless of your own desires, your own intentions, your own self-understanding, of having effects on the world that you did not choose and cannot stop, of existing in a way that frightens others before you have done anything at all, simply by virtue of what you have been made into. The ancient world did not articulate this in the psychological language we might reach for now. But myths don't need to articulate things explicitly to carry them. They carry them in their structure, in the shape of what they describe, in the way that the people who told and retold these stories recognize something true in them, even if they couldn't have said precisely what. Into this landscape eventually came Perseus. Perseus was the son of Zeus, and a mortal woman named Danae. His birth was itself the product of divine violence, or divine manipulation. Zeus, wanting Danae, came to her imprisoned in a shower of golden light, which the mythological tradition presents as miraculous, and which we might understand as the application of overwhelming divine power to a situation where an ordinary woman had no meaningful ability to refuse. Perseus was the result. He was raised in poverty and difficulty, as heroes often are in Greek mythology. The tradition seems to believe that suffering is a prerequisite for heroism, or perhaps more accurately that the stories of people who suffered and then accomplished great things were simply more interesting than the stories of people who were comfortable throughout. He was young, brave, and largely without resources, which is precisely the state in which kings tend to send young men on impossible quests. A king named Polydectes wanted Danae and wanted Perseus out of the way. He demanded that Perseus bring him the head of Medusa as a gift, understanding this to be, in practical terms, a death sentence. No mortal could approach the Gorgon and survive. It was an errand designed to eliminate him. What happened next is where the myth begins to reveal its architecture most clearly, an understanding that architecture is important, because it changes how we see the encounter between Perseus and Medusa. Perseus did not succeed on his own merits. The mythological tradition is very clear about this, in a way that is sometimes underemphasized in later retellings that want him to be straightforwardly heroic. He was assisted at every significant turn by the gods. Athena came to him and gave him guidance, and in most versions the mirrored shield that would be his essential tool. Hermes, the messenger god, gave him winged sandals, the ability to fly. He was told to seek out the Grey, 3 other sisters, sharing a single eye and a single tooth between them, and from them he learned the location of certain nymphs who gave him additional equipment. A satchel called the kibisis, which could safely contain the severed head, and a cap that made him invisible. He received from Hermes a curved blade, the harp, specifically suited to the task. He arrived at the place of the Gorgons equipped with wings, invisibility, a divine weapon, a magical satchel, and a mirrored shield. He had divine guidance from both Athena and Hermes. He was, in almost every practical sense, being carried through the mission by divine support, with Medusa as the specific target. This does not make him a villain. Perseus in the mythological tradition is generally portrayed as a decent figure, brave, loyal to his mother, without particular cruelty. He was doing what he was sent to do. The mission was not his idea, and he was not given much choice about undertaking it. He is not the monster of the story, any more than Medusa is, but he is also not the sole author of what happened. He was the instrument of a story that larger powers had already arranged, and Medusa, who had already been transformed by larger powers once, was about to be transformed again by them, this time permanently, this time finally. The mirrored shield. Of all the elements in the story of Medusa and Perseus, this one tends to receive the least analysis and deserves probably the most, because it is not merely a practical tool that allowed Perseus to approach Medusa without being turned to stone. It is, if you allow yourself to see it, the symbolic heart of the entire encounter. Medusa had been made into something that destroyed by being seen directly. The curse, whatever its precise origin and intent, operated on the axis of the direct gaze. You looked at her, really looked, and you were destroyed. This was not something she controlled or chose. It was simply what she was now, the way certain flowers are toxic when touched. Not from malice, simply from nature, from the fact of what they are. Perseus could not look at her directly. He could only see her reflected, reversed, inverted, at one remove from the reality of her. The mirror showed him a true image in a certain sense, all the visual information of her face and form, but it was not a direct confrontation. He was seeing her as something other than she fully was, mediated through the polished surface of a shield, flipped left to right, framed and contained. He could only approach her when she was reversed. In classical mythology, there is a long tradition of reading the relationships between myths as structural rather than accidental. Not conspiracy theory reading, not the insistence that everything means exactly one thing, but the recognition that the Greeks were thoughtful storytellers who understood how symbols echoed each other. And in this case, the echo is hard to miss. Medusa was destroyed by being directly gazed upon, by the gaze of a god who had the power to do what that gaze implied. Her curse made direct gazing fatal to the one gazing, and now she could only be approached indirectly, in reflection, at the moment of her death. The whole story turns on the question of how we look at things, and what looking does to both the seer and the seen. She was seen too directly once, and it destroyed her life. She was seen only indirectly in the end, and it destroyed her. The mirror that was supposed to be a solution was also, in its own way, a continuation of the original problem. She was never simply encountered. She was always encountered through some distorting lens. Desire, fear, the curved surface of bronze. Never plainly. Never simply as what she was. This might be the thing the myth knows that it never quite says. When Perseus struck the killing blow, he was invisible, approaching from above, guided by the reflection in his shield. Medusa was asleep in most versions of the story. He came upon her in the particular vulnerability of sleep, which is one of those mythological details that the tradition records without apparent moral discomfort. She did not see him coming. She could not have defended herself if she had, against a figure equipped as Perseus was equipped. It happened quickly. And then something unexpected, extraordinary and quietly devastating occurred. From Medusa's blood and severed neck, two beings emerged fully formed. Chrysa, a giant with a golden sword, and Pegasus, the winged horse. Pegasus. Let yourself stay with this for a moment, because it is one of those mythological details that tends to get absorbed too quickly into the general flow of the story. Pegasus, that image of impossible grace, the winged horse that would go on to be ridden by the hero Bellerophon, that would become one of the most enduring and beloved figures in the entire mythological tradition, that luminous creature that meant something like freedom and poetry and the life of the mind to centuries of people who came after. Pegasus was born from Medusa's body at the moment of her death. The children she had carried through all those years of isolation, the children of the violence she'd endured, born finally not into a world that could nurture them, but into the immediate aftermath of their mother's killing. Pegasus flew. He rose and flew, and went on to become part of the stories the world told about beauty and possibility. The horse of the Muses, the creature associated with Helicon, and the spring hippocrene that his hoof struck from the rock, and which thereafter inspired poets. All of that beauty, all of that association with the best and most transcendent things human beings reach for, it originated in Medusa. This is the part of the story that the tradition tends to use as a kind of narrative consolation. Look what beauty came from the monster's death. Look how the horror led to something extraordinary. And there is something there, genuinely. But it is also worth holding the grief of it alongside the wonder. Medusa didn't get to know Pegasus. She didn't get to watch him fly. She was gone before he had learned the shape of his own wings. What came from her was not available to her. Perseus carried the head south. In the mythology, as he flew over Libya, drops of Medusa's blood fell from the head as it rested in the Kibesis, and from those drops of blood emerged the serpents of North Africa, the ancient mythological explanation for why that region was full of dangerous snakes. Other drops, falling on rock, became coral in the sea below. In some versions, the goddess Athena later used the blood from Medusa's left side to create a poison, and blood from her right side to create a medicine capable of raising the dead, which she gave to Asclepius, the god of medicine. Even in death, even in fragments, Medusa was generative. Her blood made things, creatures, coral, poisons, cures. Her existence and the end of it radiated outward into the world in ways that continued long after she herself was gone. Perseus went on to further adventures. He rescued Andromeda, defeated more enemies, returned to his homeland, fulfilled his destiny in the ways that heroes do. He was mortal, like Medusa, and eventually he too died, and his story ended. But before he gave the head to Athena, he used it as a weapon. This is one of those details that tends to disappear into the surrounding heroics without receiving the attention it deserves. The head of Medusa, still capable of turning anyone who looked at it directly to stone, became a weapon in Perseus's hands. He used it against enemies. He used it in some versions to rescue Andromeda by turning the sea monster threatening her to stone. He used it against the king Polydectes, who had sent him on the quest in the first place, and he showed the head to that king, and Polydectes became stone. And then he gave the head to Athena, the goddess who had guided him to Medusa in the first place, the goddess whose involvement with Medusa's story goes back to the very beginning. And Athena placed it on her aegis, the aegis. Athena's great protective device, variously described as a breastplate, a shield, or a kind of divine garment made from the skin of a monster, became the permanent home of Medusa's face, the Gorgonean, the terrible visage now mounted on the armour of the goddess of wisdom, facing outward, still carrying its power of terror and transformation, now deployed as protection, rather than as a threat. The Gorgonean, the motif of Medusa's face, round and terrible, often depicted with a wide mouth, protruding tongue, serpentine hair, and a gaze of tremendous intensity, became one of the most widespread protective symbols in the ancient Greek and Roman world. It appeared on temple pediments, as the oldest surviving example shows on the Temple of Artemis at Corfu, dating to around 580 before the Common Era. It appeared on coins, on armour, on doorways and thresholds, on pottery, on jewellery. The face of the Gorgon was placed at the entrances to important spaces to ward off evil, to frighten away malevolent forces, to announce that this place was protected and that whatever threatened it would meet something they could not overcome. Archaeologists have found Gorgonea across the ancient Mediterranean world, from Spain to the Black Sea, from Britain to North Africa. The symbol spread with Greek and then Roman culture and persisted for centuries, through the Hellenistic period and deep into the Roman Empire. In some areas it merged with other protective faces, other apotropaic figures, becoming part of a broader visual tradition of using the terrible face as a shield. There is something strange and something also, if you let yourself feel it, something quietly meaningful in this. The face that made Medusa unable to interact with the world, the face that isolated her and frightened away every living being, that face became, in the broader culture, a symbol of protection. The thing that destroyed became the thing that defended. The transformation that had been imposed on her turned into an emblem that people chose to carry, to put above their doors, to wear on their bodies. The Greeks were not being deliberately ironic about this. They were expressing something their culture understood, that protective power comes from what has survived tremendous danger, that the most potent wards against harm are made from the stuff of harm itself. But from Medusa's perspective, if we are generous enough to imagine her one, the world found a use for her face long after she was gone to have any say in the matter. She was used in her lifetime, transformed against her will, turned into something that could be deployed. And her face went on being used afterward, never simply existing, always functioning, always serving someone else's purposes. This is the saddest part of her story if you follow it all the way through. Not the transformation, not even the death, but the fact that there was never a version of her existence that was simply hers. She was always caught in someone else's story, someone else's gaze, someone else's need. She was beautiful for the wrong person's attention. She was transformed by a goddess who had her own agenda. She was killed by a hero who was being used as an instrument by that same goddess. And her face was mounted on that goddess's armour for eternity. There is no moment in the surviving tradition where Medusa simply gets to be Medusa on her own terms for her own sake. The ancient Greek scholarly tradition did occasionally attempt to rationalise myths, to explain them as allegory, as distorted history, as moral instruction or natural philosophy. The Gorgons, in some of these rationalising readings, were understood as representing something real, perhaps an actual tribe of fierce women warriors encountered by early Greek explorers in Libya or North Africa, whose terrifying aspect in battle had been elaborated over time into the supernatural. Perhaps they represented a form of natural phenomenon, the paralytic gaze of certain animals or a volcanic landscape that seemed to turn things to stone. None of these rationalizations quite satisfies, because they miss what myths are actually doing. Myths are not failed attempts at natural history or journalism. They are ways of encoding experience, of giving shape to things that resist straightforward articulation: fear, grief, desire, the terror of transformation, the helplessness of being subject to forces larger than yourself. Medusa's story is not a garbled report about a real woman who was particularly frightening. It is a story about what it means to be changed by something that had power over you, and to live in the aftermath of that change, and to be seen forever after as the changed thing, rather than as the person you were before. The ancient world produced this story, and kept it, and passed it on, and added to it, and changed it, because something in it was true in the way that myth is true. Not factually, not historically, but emotionally, structurally, in the shape of it. It mapped onto something that people recognised. People who have been transformed by trauma recognise something in Medusa. People who have been made into something frightening by what happened to them, who find that the world responds to what they became rather than to who they are, who are isolated by the very changes that were imposed on them. They recognise something in her. This is why the story has lasted. Not because the Greeks believed in literal gorgons with serpent hair, but because the emotional truth of it keeps finding people who know it from the inside. The mythological tradition that grew up around Greek myth in later centuries often tried to give it cleaner moral architecture than it actually has. The gods were turned into symbols of virtues or forces. The heroes were simplified into examples of courage or cleverness or piety. The monsters were made into pure evil to be defeated, obstacles in the path of the righteous protagonist. Medusa was one of the casualties of this simplification. The complicated mortal woman at the edge of the world, transformed by violence into something isolating and terrible, became simply the monster that Perseus had to defeat on his way to becoming Perseus. The story of what happened to her, which Ovid preserved, and which is the most detailed surviving account we have, became a footnote in the story of the hero, Perseus's story. This is the particular alchemy that myths perform when power writes them. The person who suffered becomes the obstacle. The obstacle is overcome. The hero moves on, and the story is about the hero. There is a long tradition in classical scholarship of what is sometimes called euhemerism, the approach of treating myths as distorted memories of real events or real people. In this reading, perhaps the Gorgons were real women, a tribe of formidable warriors encountered by early Greek seafarers on the coast of Libya or in the far western Mediterranean, whose terrifying aspect in combat had been gradually elaborated over generations into the supernatural. Perhaps Medusa was a specific leader of such a group, killed in an encounter that became the seed of the Perseus story. Perhaps the serpent imagery came from some aspect of their appearance or their culture, headdresses, tattoos, sacred animals, that Greek eyes did not know how to categorise and so translated into myth. We cannot know, and ultimately the euhemeristic reading, however interesting as speculation, does not quite reach what matters most about the story. Myths are not failed history. They are something more direct than history, a way of giving shape and name to experiences that resist ordinary articulation. Whether or not a real woman existed at the root of the Medusa story, the story itself is real in the way that emotional truth is real. It describes something that has been true for many people across many centuries. That is why it persisted. That is why it is still here. Except that 2,000 years later, we are not here to hear the story of the hero. We are here tonight to sit with Medusa at the edge of the world, in the grey and liminal space that was her home for all those years between the transformation and the ending. We are here to remember that she was a person before she was a monster, and that the story of how she became a monster is not a story about something she deserved. We are here to hear the version that the tradition didn't quite lose, but didn't quite centre either. The one that Ovid preserved in a few careful paragraphs nested inside a hero's banquet speech. The one that requires you to slow down and read carefully to see it. The one where, before the serpents and the terrible gaze and the curse, there was a woman with extraordinary hair, living at the edge of the known world with her sisters, mortal in a family of immortals, already alone in the way that being the only one who can die makes you alone. She never asked for any of it. That is worth saying plainly, and worth saying once more before we close. She never asked for any of it. Not for the beauty that attracted the wrong attention, not for the violation in the sacred space, not for the transformation that made her terrible to look upon, not for the isolation that followed, not for the hero who came to kill her, not for the use her death was put to, or the enduring use her face was put to, affixed to the armour of the goddess who had set all of this in motion. None of it was asked for. All of it arrived anyway. And she moved through it, as mortals do, because moving through the unbidden is what mortal life consists of in the end. The long practice of continuing in the face of what we did not choose. And so we come to the end of her story, which was also her beginning, or is also her beginning, depending on which direction you approach it from. Because Medusa's story is one of those that you can enter from multiple places and find a different shape to it depending on where you start. Start from the hero's quest, and she is a monster to be defeated, a step on the way to greater things, and her death is a triumph. Start from the ancient primordial lineage, daughter of Phorcys and Ceto, granddaughter of the deep ocean itself, child of forces older than the Olympians. And she is something closer to a natural force, a being of the threshold, whose existence at the edge of the world was always inevitable, always part of the structure of the cosmos. Start from Ovid, from the passage in the Metamorphoses that Perseus tells to the gathered guests at the feast. And she is a woman whose life was changed by something that had power over her, who lived with that change for years in isolation, and who was killed by a mission she had nothing to do with and no say in. Start from the Gorgonean, from the symbol that spread across the ancient world, and she is something that outlasted herself, a face that became protection, a terror repurposed into a ward, something that the world found more useful after her death than during her life. All of these are Medusa. None of them is the whole of her. Myths change depending on who tells them. They breathe and shift, and in their shifting they can lose things. Nuances, complexities, the quiet truth of a person inside the dramatic truth of a symbol. But they can also find things. In the right hands, in the right telling, something that was lost in the simplification can be recovered. Not invented, recovered. It was always there, in the structure of the story, in the detail that survived because Ovid was a careful poet, and even in Roman literary culture the older threads persisted. She was real to herself, in whatever version of reality the myth operates in. She had a before, she had years of after. She had hair that was remarkable, and sisters who were immortal, and a fundamental vulnerability that no one around her shared. She had a life at the edge of the world that the tradition barely paused to describe before moving on to the parts it found more interesting. We paused tonight. We stayed. We lingered in the hallways of the story and looked at what the light was doing in the corners. And perhaps that is enough. Perhaps that is the best thing a retelling can offer. Not a resolution, not a redemption, not a tidier moral than the original possessed. Just attention. Just the choice to slow down and see her, not as an obstacle, not as a symbol, not as the monster in the hero's path, but as the complicated, mortal, transformed, aching, present person who was always there in the oldest version of the story, waiting for someone to read it carefully enough to find her. The night is very deep now, the kind of deep that is almost tactile, almost a presence in itself, the quality of darkness that comes only in the hours when the rest of the world has gone quiet, and there is nothing between you and the simple fact of being here, still, breathing. Let Medusa rest. Let her be at the edge of her world, not the terrifying monster of the later tradition, not the obstacle in the hero's path, but a woman at the threshold of things, in a grey and quiet landscape that the ancient imagination placed beyond all the familiar stars, the serpent still, the sound of whatever ocean existed at the edge of the known world. Her sister's somewhere nearby, or nearby enough. She cannot be what she was before. That is the truth of transformation, and it is a hard truth, and the myth does not soften it. But she is more than what she became in the tellings that simplified her. She is more than the face on the shield, more than the monster in the cave, more than the obstacle in the hero's path. She is someone whose story is still being told, thousands of years after the poets first gave it shape, because something in it keeps finding the part of us that knows what it is to be changed by forces larger than ourselves, and to live in the aftermath, and to carry the marks of it, and to still be here, the marks and the still being here. Both of those things at once. Let your breath slow. Let the last edges of the world go soft. You have been here for the whole of her story tonight, which is more than most of her contemporaries offered her, more than the tradition, rushing toward its heroes, remembered to give her. Let that be enough. Let the deep night hold you. Let the old quiet story settle around you like something that has always been true, because it has. Sleep now. The edge of the world is still there, wherever it is, grey and borderless and full of the particular silence that exists beyond all the ordinary things. She's there too, in whatever way figures in myths persist. Not gone, not quite. As long as someone is still telling the story slowly enough to see her. someone was tonight. Sleep. For it's _Fergo who asked for this one. Sources informing this story include Hesiod's Theogony, circa 700 BCE, Homer's Iliad, circa 8th century BCE, Pindar's Pythian Odes, circa 5th century BCE, and Ovid's Metamorphoses, Book of 4, circa 8 CE. The emotional texture, interpretation, and interior life are original to this telling, in the tradition of every storyteller who has ever looked at a myth and seen the person inside it.